מ'סכת חולין דף חוף. We quote the Mishnah, וכן חתיכה של נבלה. The Mishnah compared a piece of a nevela to a gida nashe and noted that it has a similar law. If a piece of nevela, a chunk of meat from a non-kosher animal, got mixed up and cooked with kosher food, then if you can identify that piece of nevela, then you remove it, and then you see if there is enough to give taste in the rest of it, then the rest of it also will be prohibited. But if there's no taste of the nevela in the rest of the kosher food, then the rest of the food is kosher. However, if you cannot identify the nevela, there's a chunk of meat of a nevela, and the rest is also other chunks of meat that are kosher, but they all look the same. And now the nevela fell in, and you can't identify which one it is. In that case, the entire thing is prohibited, even if there's a lot more of kosher compared to just the one piece of nevela. So the Gemara asks, as it asked before about gida nashe, v'tibtil beruba. Why don't we say that it should be nullified in a majority? Generally, if it's an item as opposed to a liquid, when it's a liquid and then the taste spreads throughout, then you have to see is there taste or not. But if it's a physical item, then we say batel berov. Again, one non-kosher hot dog and two kosher hot dogs. These are dry things. They get mixed up with them. The general rule is that you follow the majority. And so there's only one chatichav nevela and two or more pieces of kosher meat, so should be batel. Okay, we can answer this according to the opinion. There is a machloket about things that are counted by piece, by item. So there are some things that when you buy them, you do it by weight, like ground beef. You're just only going to do by weight. But there are some items that you do it by the piece. If you do it by the piece, and you count how many you want to buy, 6. Okay, so you count out 6 of them. Each one is a price, not by the pound. That means each item itself is significant. Now, there are some things that are sometimes bought by the piece and sometimes bought by weight. And so there is a machloket whether those things will be nullified or not. So we understand the Mishnah, according to the opinion, it says, Kol shedar kol limanot. That is talking about things that are sometimes counted by piece, even though sometimes they're weighed. Nevertheless, and sometimes they're sold by the piece, they are considered significant, and therefore they are not batel. And that's why a chaticha is not batel, because sometimes when you buy pieces of meat, they're very nice, and so you'll sell it by the item. But the other opinion says not kol, but rather et, meaning that we only say something is not batel if it's only sold by piece. And if it's sometimes sold by weight, then it is nullified. Now here, pieces of meat sometimes are sold by the piece, sometimes by weight. And according to this opinion, they should be nullified. So what will he answer to this question? It should be batel barov. And the answer is, even this opinion that says generally items that are sold sometimes by weight and sometimes by the piece are batel, but here a piece of meat is important, it's suitable to give before a guest and to give honor to that guest with it. It's like a nice piece of steak. So a thing like that, which you would offer as is to a guest, that has intrinsic significance. And so just like we said before regarding the gida nashe, it's not batel because it's a biriyah. It's a whole item. And the principle of nullification means that something, once it becomes mixed up in something else, it's not significant anymore. So that certainly would apply to milk or things like that, where it goes in and it's gone, it disperses throughout, and there's no taste. So it's as if it's not there. That's where we say batel. Or if it's just chopped meat, which is not an item that you would honor someone, and it's sold by weight. So if the chopped meat got mixed up into other meat, then also we could say batel. However, anything that is significant in and of itself, and here, if it's something that is counted, but nevela is not always counted, okay, but it is something that is an honorable item. You could serve it to a guest to honor them. That makes it significant. Therefore, even if you have one non-kosher steak and mixed up in 100 kosher steaks, it's not batel because it has intrinsic significance. Now, why does the Mishnah need to teach me this law, that a piece of nevela is not batel, and also teach me the law regarding a gida nashe that gets mixed up with other gidim that's not batel? If you cannot identify it, then all of them are no good. If I only had the law of gid, I would say, oh, for gid is a distinct entity because it's created that way. It's a whole item. But a chaticha, a piece of steak, is not a whole item. It's cut from a whole animal, so it's not whole. I might think that this piece of steak can be batel. And if I only had the case of the steak of nevela, I would say, well, that is significant because you can honor a guest with it. But a gida nashe, you wouldn't honor a guest by serving him a sciatic nerve. That's a nerve is not a distinguished food. So I might say that the gida nashe will be batel, and that's why I need the first case. So for either of these two reasons, either it's a bidiyah or it's something that is significant that you'd serve to a guest. If it has intrinsic significance because of either of these two reasons, and it falls into other ones that are kosher, these are not batel. דרש רבה בר חנה, חתיכה של נבלה ושל דג טמא אינה אוסרת, עד שתיתן טעם ברוטב ובכיפה ובחתיכות. Rabba bar Chana taught in public the following halacha, that if a piece of nevela meat or a piece of non-kosher fish falls into a pot, it will not make the rest of the pot prohibited unless it gives taste in the broth and the other deposits of food, like spices or whatever else is in there, and the other pieces of meat. In other words, when you want to see if it gives taste, you add up all of the permitted food inside, not just the other meat or not just the broth, all of it, everything together. And if all together there's enough in the prohibited piece to give taste in everything, then the rest of it will be prohibited. But if not, then all the rest of it will be permitted. Oki Rav Amora Ale Vedarash. Rav, however, disagreed with that ruling, and he got an amora, a loudspeaker. When that's an official public lecture, the rabbi would sit and speak softly, and then an amora, a public loudspeaker, because there's many people there who would have to have a very loud voice, would go and announce the following halacha. Kevan shenatan ta'am b'chaticha, chaticha atzma na'asit nebela, ve'oseret kol ha'chatichot kulan, mipnei shehen mina. That, let's say you have a piece of non-kosher meat, and it falls into a stew with pieces of kosher meat and broth and spices and all that. Unlike the law of Rabba bar Chana that we count everything together on the permitted side, Rav says, no, not so. Once you have the prohibited meat, and that gives taste into the permitted piece of meat, let's say there's one piece of meat that's permitted inside, and it goes and touches it and imparts flavor to it, then that piece of meat that was permitted itself gets the status of being a nevela. And therefore, those pieces together will contribute to prohibit all of the other pieces of meat and all of the broth and everything else. The reason is because it's min bemino. And we're going to follow the opinion here of Rabbi Yehuda that says min bemino la batil. So the broth and other vegetables or whatever else is in there is min she'eno mino. It's fine. All that stuff will count on the permitted side. But the other meat that's of the same type, same taste as the prohibited, that is min bemino, and therefore that will count towards the prohibited side of it. Amar le Rav Safra le Abaye. No, so now they were discussing this statement of Rav, and Rav Safra asked Abaye about it. Mikedi Rav keman amara l'shma'ateh kerebi Yehuda damar min bemino la batil. I understand that Rav is following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that if it's like species, like taste, then it's not batel. So that's why the second chaticha, the second piece of meat, meaning the permitted one that is touched by the prohibited one, is not batel. And if you have one piece of non-kosher meat that falls into 100, 200 pieces of kosher meat, but they're all the same taste, then it's not going to be batel. I get it. But if you're following the Yehuda, why do you need it to be that it gave taste? Why does it have to say in kevan shenatan tam b'chaticha? Only if the first nevela piece of meat gives taste to the permitted piece of meat, then the second one becomes nevela. But it doesn't have to give taste according to the Yehuda. Afilu ki lo natan tam nameh. Right? The Yehuda says even if it's 1 in 300. But it's min b'mino, it's not batel. According to the Yehuda, you can only have nullification if there's a contrast in the tastes. So that milk falls into meat, that's a different taste. So then, if there's no taste of milk, that's fine. But if it's all the same taste, then it's not batel. And it doesn't matter if it gives taste. That's the whole point. Because it's the same taste, giving taste or not giving taste has no meaning. And it's not batel, even if it's a big ratio. And Abaye answers, Rav is talking about a case where one removed the original piece of nevela first. So it's like this. One piece of nevela falls onto a piece of kosher meat. And since they're now together, they're cooked together, it imparts flavor. And so now that second piece of meat itself becomes nevela. One then removes the original nevela and leaves this one that is only a secondary nevela. And then you add all the other broth and other stuff and other pieces of meat and vegetables and all that. That's the case that he's talking about. And he says that second piece of meat itself becomes a nevela, and you'll need to see if any taste from the first one goes into the rest of it. That's why you need there to be taste. Because if there's no taste from the first to the second, then although the second one is prohibited, because min b'mino, la batil, but if there's no taste from the first into the second, then the second will not have any taste of forbidden flavor to impart on all the rest of it. So that's why it would have to have taste in order for it to be considered itself a nevela, such that it would make the rest of the stew prohibited when you remove the first original nevela, and then you have just the second by itself. And if that then goes into a stew, or you add the stew on top of that second piece, if there is taste from the first piece, then you'll have to make sure that there's enough permitted stew to nullify the taste that went from the first into the second. That's what Rav was talking about. That's one answer. Rava amar afilu tema lo kadam v'siliko have mino mihave min umino v'davar acher. And Rava says, I can explain the case even if you did not remove the original nevela, and so a piece of nevela falls into a stew and touches one of the pieces that is kosher and makes that a nevela itself, and it remains in it. They all remain inside. The Rav is even talking about that case. How does it work? Well, this is a case of min, umino, and davar acher. Well, the nevela falls into a stew, and in that stew there is mino, other meat that's of the same taste, and there's also other things. Well, what's the rule in that case? V'chol minu mino v'davar acher, seleket mino kemi she'eno, v'she'en mino rabeh alav umebatelo. Anytime you have something that falls into a mixture where some of it is minu mino and some of it is min b'sheno mino, here's what you do. You don't physically remove it, but it means you don't count the mino, as you make it as if it's not there. In other words, that second piece, the piece of that was kosher, that touched the nevela, it doesn't contribute to the permitted side, it doesn't contribute to the prohibited side. It is prohibited by itself, and then it's as if it's not there. And then the min she'eno mino, all the rest of the broth and the spices and the vegetables and everything else, that will add all that up and see if there's enough there to nullify the original nevela. And that second piece, the one that was kosher and now touched and becomes not kosher, we do not add to this side or to that side. All that is true if there's no taste from the nevela into the second one. Then that second one is prohibited, but it doesn't add to the volume this way or that way. However, now Rav says, adds, that if there is taste from the first original piece of nevela to the piece of kosher meat that it touches, there's taste in there, in that case, the second one itself becomes nevela. And in that case, now you have two pieces, the original nevela and the one that got taste from it, which is now considered also a nevela. And Rav is teaching in that case that then the piece of kosher meat that became nevela does count towards the volume of prohibition, and you will need then enough in the broth and the other vegetables and spices. You'll need enough to nullify both pieces of meat, both the original kosher, the original nevela, and also the kosher one that received taste from the nevela. Next Mishnah, noheg bat tehora ve'eno noheg bat teme'ah. The prohibition of gid hanasheh applies to kosher animals. It does not apply to non-kosher animals. So therefore, if someone eats the gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, they may very well violate the prohibition of eating a non-kosher animal, but they will not violate the prohibition of gid hanasheh. Whether you violate eating a non-kosher animal will depend on if you think that the gid hanasheh has taste, because eating non-kosher meat only applies to meat that is something edible, and not to parts of the animal that are not edible. Rabbi Yehuda omed af beteme'ah. Rabbi Yehuda says that the prohibition of gid hanasheh applies also to non-kosher animals. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, והלא מבני יעקב נאסר גיד הנשה, ועדיין בהמה טמאה מותרת להן. Rabbi Yehuda explains that the gid hanasheh was prohibited already from the time of Yaakov and his sons, and at that time, the non-kosher animals were permitted to them. It's only from Har Sinai and on, that's when we learn about kosher animals and non-kosher animals. Before Har Sinai, all animals were permitted to eat. And yet, the prohibition of gid hanasheh is given to Yaakov. It says, therefore, right after he fights with the angel, therefore, Bnei Israel, do not eat the gid hanasheh. So you see that the original prohibition applied at a time when all animals were permitted to eat. Therefore, gid hanasheh must continue to apply to all animals, kosher and not kosher. However, the sages say, not so. The gid hanasheh was prohibited only from Har Sinai and onward, except that the story was, and the prohibition was written back in its place. In other words, we learn about the story of Yaakov fighting with the angel, and since we told the story, so we mention over there, oh, by the way, there is a prohibition that will eventually become a prohibition at the time of Sinai. So really that law, although it's mentioned in Bereshit, is a retrospective law that we know was only commanded at Har Sinai. And now it is on the basis of the story that is why eventually at Har Sinai gid hanasheh was prohibited, because once upon a time, a long time before, Yaakov Abinu fought with the angel and his thigh was injured. That's why at Har Sinai it becomes prohibited. And the Torah puts that prohibition and mentions it in the place of the story that inspired the law. But actually there was no prohibition before Har Sinai. Therefore, since it only applies from Har Sinai and onward, it's only going to apply to kosher animals that you can eat. You can eat the rest of the animal, but don't eat the gid hanasheh. But non-kosher animals are already prohibited anyway because they're not kosher. Now Gemara asks, V'savar Rabbi Yehuda isur hal al isur. Rabbi Yehuda, who says that gid hanasheh does apply to non-kosher animals. How could that be? Does he think that a prohibition can take effect on another prohibition? There's a general rule that once something is already prohibited for whatever reason A, then you cannot get another prohibition on top of it. Now there are some exceptions, like if the second prohibition includes more things or more people. Okay, so there are exceptions, but right now, just looking at it, it seems that this would be a problem because you have two prohibitions on top of each other. How can that be? והתניא רבי יהודה אומר, יכול תהא נבלת עוף טמא מטמא בגדים בבית הבליעה, תלמוד אומר נבלה וטרפה לא יאכל לטומאה בה. מי שאיסורו משום בעל תאכל נבלה, יעשה זה שאין איסורו משום בעל תאכל נבלה, אלא משום בעל תאכל טמאה. We're going to prove from the following Baraita that Rabbi Yehuda says, in general, that you cannot have a prohibition that applies to another prohibition. So we see this from this Baraita, where Rabbi Yehuda himself says, if someone swallows the nevela of a non-kosher bird, will his clothing become tameh? The law regarding a kosher bird is, if someone swallows a kosher bird that is ritually impure, that's tameh, then he becomes tameh when that piece of bird is in his throat. While it's in his throat, then his clothing becomes tameh, whatever he touches becomes tameh, a high level of tum'ah. That's for a kosher species of bird. Now, would that apply also to a non-kosher species of bird? No, because the pasuk says, nebela utrefa, do not eat, letom abba, to become tameh. Only a species of bird that can be prohibited as a nevela, that's only kosher species. A kosher species of bird, you can do shechita, and then that will be good. That it won't be a nevela. Or if you kill it without shechita, then it's a nevela. But the category of nevela only applies to a kosher species. That one, if you eat it, you become tameh while it's in your throat. But that will exclude a type of bird that has no prohibition of eating a nevela, because it's only prohibited as bal tochal teme'ah. Teme'ah here in the sense of being a non-kosher bird. From that last line, we see that according to the Yehuda, if something is already prohibited because it's a non-kosher species, then it does not get an additional prohibition if it dies on its own as a nevela. It's already a non-kosher species. So therefore it makes no difference if you do shechita. If you don't do shechita, anyone who eats it will violate eating a non-kosher species of bird, but you do not violate a nevela because it's already prohibited for one reason. So a second prohibition of nevela will not come and add and apply to it. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda generally does think that and isur hal al isur. So how could he say here that we have two prohibitions of gid nasheh and also that it's a non-kosher animal? Maybe Rabbi Yehuda thinks that the sinews have no taste, and therefore the gid nasheh, if it's in a non-kosher animal, it will have one prohibition of gid nasheh. It will not have a prohibition of non-kosher meat because it's not an edible part of the animal. And so therefore you have a non-kosher animal, its meat is prohibited as non-kosher. Okay, so don't eat the meat. And the other parts of it that are not edible, like the gid nasheh, do not have a prohibition of non-kosher food. As a non-kosher species. And therefore, the gid nasheh will apply to that, because only one prohibition applies to the gid nasheh itself. So maybe that's the explanation. That also does not work. Does Rabbi Yehuda think that there's no taste in the gid? We have a baraita that says someone who eats a gid nasheh of a non-kosher animal, Rabbi Yehuda says, he gets two sets of lashes, one for eating gid nasheh and the other one for eating a non-kosher species. So you see that he thinks that it does have taste, and therefore eating it does violate having a non-kosher species. Rabbi Shimon says he's exempt totally because he thinks it does not have flavor, and therefore there's no problem of eating non-kosher. And Rabbi Shimon thinks that the gid nasheh prohibition does not apply to non-kosher animals, and so therefore that's an interesting case. Rabbi Shimon says zero lashes, no prohibition, and Rabbi Yehuda says he's liable twice. Anyway, the point is that both prohibitions do apply. So we bring back our question: how come Rabbi Yehuda can allow two prohibitions to apply to one thing? Doesn't he say en isur hal al isur? And the answer is leolam kasabar yesh begidim benoten tam vekasabar noheg bashalil te isur gid veisur tuma behadeh hadadeh kaateh. One of the exceptions to the rule of en isur hal al isur is that applies only if there's one prohibition at one point in time, and then later on a second prohibition wants to come. No, we do not allow a second prohibition to apply to a pre-existing prohibition. However, if both prohibitions come into effect at the same time simultaneously, then they can both take effect. And that's what happens here, because he says, yes, that a gid nasheh does have taste. That's true. So both prohibitions will apply to it. And he thinks that the prohibition applies to a fetus. And therefore, the prohibition of gida nasheh and the prohibition of it being a non-kosher species of animal, they both occur at the same time. As it's developing, as the fetus is developing, at some point in time, when it's considered a thing, whenever that is, so it will have sinews and it will have flesh and it will be a being, even though it's only a fetus. At that point, both prohibitions appear at the same time. Since they apply simultaneously, both of them in fact do apply. Now we ask, can you say that the gida nasheh applies to a fetus? We have a Mishnah that we learned already that says, according to Tanakama, the gida nasheh applies to a fetus. We said that would be the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who thinks that a fetus of a kosher animal is its own entity and therefore requires its own shechita. So its gida nasheh has its own prohibition. That's true for Rabbi Meir. However, Rabbi Yehuda says that gida nasheh does not apply to a fetus, and even the chaleb, that fat of the fetus, is permitted because he thinks that the fetus is ubar yerech imo. It is just a limb of the mother, not its own, does not have its own status. Shechita of the mother will cover the fetus also, and therefore he says the gida nasheh does not apply to a fetus. So that doesn't work, because that would mean that the gida nasheh prohibition will only apply once it's born or after, whereas the prohibition of non-kosher meat will apply even while it's a fetus. So now they do not apply simultaneously. The answer to that is hanemi legabe tehora. Yes, that's true regarding a kosher animal. That's what the Yehuda says, that ubad yerech imo, that it's just a part of the mother. Because the pasuk says any animal with divides its hoof and has chooses cud, so any kosher animal, ba behema, that's inside another animal, meaning when it's pregnant a fetus, tochelu, that you can eat by the shechita of the mother covers it. But that rule only applies to kosher animals. Aval beteme'ah noheg, but a non-kosher animal, we consider the fetus to be its own entity, and therefore the gida nasheh will apply to a fetus of a non-kosher animal, and it will come into effect simultaneously as that fetus is developing. As it develops its sinews, now it becomes a thing, an animal, its own being, and so simultaneously gida nasheh and the prohibited non-kosher meat apply at the same time. Now we question that. Can you really say they come simultaneously in its development? We have Mishnah Ma'sechet Nazir that says a Nazir has to shave if he becomes tameh by touching a dead body or one kezayit of a dead body. Now we ask about that Mishnah. If he has to shave and start over again when it becomes tameh from a kezayit of a dead body, all the more so if it's an entire dead body. Why would you even have to say that? Certainly, an entire dead body is bigger than a kezayit. Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo nisrachel lenefesh shelo nitkashru avara begidin. And Rabbi Yochanan explained that we need the line al hamet to include a fetus whose limbs have not yet been joined by sinews. At that point, it's very small. A human fetus without sinews is so small, it's actually less than a kezayit. Nevertheless, since it's a whole being, it will cause tum'ah to a nazir and he'll have to start. So we actually need both cases, both if it's a regular body, but it's only kezayit, that causes tum'ah, or even if it's smaller than a kezayit, but it's a whole body, which would apply in the case of a fetus that is very young, very underdeveloped, doesn't yet have sinews. Anyway, well, the point of all this is to show alma isur tum'ah kadim. We see that a body becomes tameh when it is a complete body, but that happens even before it gets sinews, because Rabbi Yochanan says that yet the sinews have not yet formed. So therefore, we see in an animal also, during the stages of development, first the animal will form a body, and once it forms a body, then it becomes a non-kosher animal. Anyone who would eat a piece of that would violate eating a non-kosher animal. And it doesn't have sinews yet. Some time later, it develops sinews as it's growing as a fetus. And so the sinews come later. Well, you can't have a prohibition of Gida Nasheh if there are no sinews in existence. So we see that the Gida Nasheh would have to come after the meat is already not kosher. And so therefore, you cannot say it's simultaneous because the non-kosher meat status will come first. And therefore, we should say, En Isur Hal Al Isur. And the answer to that is, Af agav de isur tuma kadim, ate isur gid hayilale, sheken isuro noheg bibne noach. And the answer is that even though the prohibition of it being non-kosher meat, a non-kosher species of meat, comes first, you're right, it does come first as soon as it becomes a fetus, even before there are sinews. And then the sinews develop, and that is going to come on a secondary level. It still does apply because the prohibition of Gida Nasheh applies to a wider group of people. It applies also to Bnei Noach, to non-Jews. And therefore, it's since it's a wider spread, it will apply to a pre-existing prohibition. The first prohibition of it not being a non-kosher species only applies to Jews. Non-Jews can eat non-kosher species. So it has a more limited prohibition. And now a Gida Nasheh prohibition applies to more people, so it does apply, and therefore, if a non-Jew would eat it, they would violate just one prohibition of Gida Nasheh, no problem with eating non-kosher meat. But if a Jew would eat it, then he would violate two prohibitions. Number one, of eating non-kosher meat, and the Gida Nasheh has taste according to the Yehuda, and second prohibition of eating the Gida Nasheh. And this answer actually makes sense. We're not just backing into it to cover our bases, but rather it must be that Rabbi Yehuda really does think that, because Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah said that we learn the prohibition of Gida Nasheh from the children of Yaakov, all the way back there in Bereshit, and that's before there ever was a prohibition of non-kosher animals. And therefore, you see, since this prohibition pre-existed Matan Torah, therefore it should apply also to Bnei Noach. It should apply to non-Jews as well. Since it applies to non-Jews, so it applies to more people than just non-kosher meat. If it applies to more people, then you can have Isur, a wider Isur, will apply to a pre-existing Isur, pre-existing in the sense not chronologically, because Gida Nasheh started from Yaakov Avinu, and then the prohibition of non-kosher animals started at Har Sinai. We mean pre-existing in the course of development of the fetus, that first it becomes an animal, and because its own being, and has non-kosher meat status, and then only later when it gets sinews, now the Gida Nasheh prohibition will apply because that prohibition includes more people. So yes, it can apply upon the prior Isur. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.